Thank you, Professor Ozunu and Professor Mishra, for having me here, first of all, and for your warm welcome and the brief introduction. First, let me share the screen, and please let me know if you see it and if you can hear me also. So,
yes, loud and clear.
thank you. In the next 15 minutes, I want to give you an overview on this most complex and important topic when dealing with disaster as a basic starting point in our debate by presenting you the key features of what risk perception is and factors that influence how we experience risk in this modern society with reference to specific case studies for emphasizing this spatial variety in risk perception. All presented findings are based on psychometric research conducted at the Center on Risk Studies I coordinate at the University of Bucharest. So the first question is why? Why is it so important to understand risk perception when dealing with disasters? I think you all will agree with me when I say that all our day-to-day decisions are based on perceptions. Also, how we perceive events is thought to shape our behaviors. So the higher the risk perception is, more probably we will change our behaviors. Secondly, as Ulrich Beck stated in its risk society concept in the early 80s, we live in a world of increasing threats, explained by the fact that this modern society creates its own risks. These modern risks are totally different from risks in the past. What is more important is that the most vulnerable will be even more vulnerable after disasters. So vulnerability and perceived vulnerability are also most important factors in creating risk perceptions. Let us focus now a little bit on this graph. What does it show us? In its upper part, there is the perceived reality of different events, and in its lower part, we have the statistical evidence of the same incidents. As you can see, we are often more afraid of some risks that the evidence says we don't need to be. And we are just as often not as afraid of some other risks as the evidence says we ought to be. Why this? How can we explain it? What we perceive as risky, it is always related to the perceived level of control we have over those things or activities or events or whatsoever. So let us look again on this graph and take only two examples we all know. We have car accidents in blue, and we have these plane accidents in plum, one near the other, and they look the same but mirrored. I think we also agree with me when I state that we are much more in control when driving our own car than when we fly. From previous research, we know losing control equals to experience loss and damage. As a result, we generally view flying as more risky than driving, even if flying has a low probability of accidents. So our fears don't match the facts. In literature, this is named risk perception gap and has serious consequences to our choices. This perception gap comes from innate features of our human cognition. So people's judgments are impacted by several factors, some of them shown also on this slide. Please keep this graph in mind for later as we go now through our presentation, and let's have some background on risk perception. What is actually risk perception? What is sure, we know risks in risk perception are not a physical thing. So we have an objective risk as used in engineering approaches, where risks are all kind of events that can affect us, where these risks are estimated from historical observation of frequencies and consequences. And the general assumption is that history and risk modeling will allow us to predict the future. And we have this subjective risk as analyzed by social scientists, where risk reflects thoughts, beliefs, in general mental constructs or mental models or semantic images, as Ren named them in 2008, which allow people to cope with dangerous events. The level of perceived risk is always a subjective risk judgment. It is an intuitive judgment. So, summarizing, risk perception refers not to the objective reality, but to a subjective evaluation of threats and benefits. We can state that perceived risk level is the subjective assessment on how much we are willing to lose, because in people's mind, as I mentioned before, to be at risk means to lose, not having control over something that can be an event, situation, action, whatsoever, activity. But the next question is, how does perception work? We know that knowledge is not the only factor shaping perception. So what are the other factors that influence how we perceive risk? On the next slide, there are the factors that shape our intuitive judgments about the characteristics, severity, and likelihood of risk. We see that building risk perception is a nested process with a shell-like aspect. All these factors, what is most important, act at our subconscious level. In a bottom-up approach, the first biological headline about risk perception is our brain. In the way the brain is built and operates emotions, the components of risk perception are the subconscious, these instinctive ones, and are in relation with how our brain is built, what we know from the neuroarchitecture science. So we think that all is going on in our minds is reasoning, but most of it is instinctive, it is emotional, it is beyond our free will. So in our cortex, among other things, we think, we reason. The thalamus is for our fear response, and it takes the internal and external stimuli and passes them on. And this amygdala is the place where actually fear starts. So as you can see, amygdala is very close to the thalamus. And being so close to the thalamus, it is the first signal received by the thalamus in case of a threat that sends it to the prefrontal cortex to think it over. So our brain is hardwired to feel first and think second, and emotions always overwhelm conscious reasoning. At this point, you may think, okay, we might be born to be afraid of snakes, of tigers, or deep waters. But how does this amygdala knows about climate change and things we are not born to be afraid of? So let's go back to our graph. it turns out that we have developed what are called the heuristics and biases. This is a fancy way of saying we have mental shortcuts to make quick sense of limited information on the fly before we have a chance to get more information. So during our evolution, we develop tools to make a quick sense of limited information that might be dangerous to us, to quickly have a reaction. So now remember the graph with so to perceive, tell me if my time, if I'm out of time, because I see only my screen. I want to go back to this graph with perceived versus objective risk we saw at the beginning of our presentation. And resumming, we are more afraid than we need to be based on what the evidence suggests. At this time, or not afraid enough, it works both ways, because risks have so-called personality traits, as found by Paul Slovic and others. They have this, what does personality traits mean? Personality characteristics that make them feel more or less scary for different people or groups of persons. So, for example, in Romania and in Bucharest, people are more afraid of natural hazards that are not under control than of human-made ones, the same risks. In more environmental conscious societies, people are more afraid of human-made hazards compared to the same natural hazards. For example, they have no problem lying in the sun for hours, but are afraid of similar carcinogenic radiation from nuclear power or nuclear power waste. The reason is we go in the sun because we want so, but no one of us wants the nuclear radiation cloud from Fukushima here in the picture, or from Ukraine to blow over. So the fear is bigger when the event or situation is imposed. A risk that is imposed feels bigger than the same risk if we take it ourselves. On the other hand, we perceive events we are familiar with as less dangerous than those we know little about. So we are less afraid of lying in the sun than risks associated with living close to a nuclear power plant. But our research findings underline another interesting fact related to hazard characteristics. Perception patterns are more related to psychological features as self-confidence, perceived stress vulnerability, or locus of control than to hazard key characteristics like severity and likelihood. Let's go back now to our graph, and let's go to its upper level. We see here this upper layer where we have this so-called cultural background or cultural cognition by Daniel Kahan and others, where you support your issue based on the facts that you have learned. Actually, we select those facts that allow our view to agree with those in the groups that we are most strongly identify with. So we can say our opinion gets along with our friends. Why is this a very important part of risk perception too? Because we are social beings, and in time of crisis, the tribe helps us survive. If everyone agrees in our tribe, also our tribe does better in its combat with other tribes. On the other hand, if the tribe is shunning us because our views are different, we will not survive difficult times. So we have learned very early, social rejection is dangerous. We evolved to be aware of social acceptance. Finally, I would like to briefly share with you some other results from our previous research, pinpointing other factors influence perceptions from the previous graph. In our research design, we adopted a three-factor model of risk perception, the perceived probability of a disaster to occur, the perceived potential damage caused by a disaster, and the perceived individual's vulnerability to those hazards. So far, our main findings underline that high level of risk perception are closely related to the perceived potential damage caused by the disaster. Those who do worry about future disaster and who also feel less prepared tend to trust entities engaged in disaster defense as government and fire departments and expect more support from stakeholders in general. Trust is the most important factor in shaping the risk disaster and risk perceptions at a social level. When we are not able to protect ourselves from dangers, we ask the government to protect us from what we cannot protect ourselves from, a pattern that is more common for developed societies. When self-confidence decreases, it increases the need of support from outside. And when this need is not satisfied, stress increases. This is the pattern for the so-called societies that are in their way underdeveloped. I don't like this word. Perceived stress and locus of control are inversely related to educational level and family income. It is an increase of risk perception in population groups with lower educational background, and always women and elderly have higher risk and higher levels of risk perception and stress vulnerability. On this last slide are listed some key findings, takeaways. I will not insist on because I think I'm running out of time. And on this slide are some of our research papers, but you can go to our website for a full list of our publications. Thank you very much.